What happens when a writing platform with more than 65 million users gets into the publishing game? Find out right now on Disruptor.
From the edges of publishing, it's Disruptor, celebrating the rebels, mavericks, and weirdos of the publishing industry and encouraging each of you to disrupt in your own way. Now here's your host, John Bard.
Greetings, one and all. I'm John Bard. Welcome to Disruptor, Episode 10, with Ashleigh Gardner of Wattpad Books. I've been in the publishing world for close to 30 years, and I've seen a lot of things change, but maybe they haven't changed fast enough. And so I asked the question, are there disruptors out there? Are there people and companies that are really changing things in publishing, pushing us into the future, throwing out the old rule book and creating a new one all their own? I went in search of that, and I found them. And on each episode of Disruptor, you'll meet them. Welcome to the journey. It's time to disrupt. Today's episode of Disruptor is brought to you by Writing Blueprints, the breakthrough step-by-step system for writers that creates truly great books. To learn more about the most disruptive way ever to become a successful author, visit writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10% off everything on the site. The writing world has been shaken. Meet the earthquake. Go to writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10%. Writing Blueprints. This is how you write a book. Having empowered more than 65 million writers to share their work with the world, Wattpad is as disruptive a force as there is in the world of publishing. Now, they're taking it to the next level with the creation of Wattpad Books, the company's first book publishing division. The woman in charge is Ashleigh Gardner, and she's here right now on Disruptor. When we talk about disruption in publishing these days, you have to talk about Wattpad. And so as the show is called Disruptor, it couldn't be more appropriate to have Ashleigh Gardner with us from Wattpad. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Let's
begin with the question that we always ask to start with every guest. You know, we do celebrate the rebels, mavericks, and weirdos of the publishing world. Which one of those words best fits you and why?
So what were my options again?
Rebel, maverick, or weirdo. Or if you'd like, you can go for none of the above.
I think I like maverick the best out of those.
How come?
I think that I would consider myself less of a rebel, and that I always feel like I've been working to find common ground with different groups. Yeah, I think I'm a little bit too basic to be a weirdo sometimes. But I feel like I've always been doing interesting things on the edge of technology and literature. That's always been the intersection that's most interested me, and I've gotten to do a lot of new things and change the way we do business at Wattpad and the way that we get other publishers to work. I think I've been really good at, speaking tech to business to lead people through a lot of change.
Great. Let's begin first for folks who maybe aren't completely familiar with Wattpad, or maybe just don't have their brains around what Wattpad is. How would you explain the general concept of Wattpad to someone who is new to it?
Yeah, so Wattpad, we're a global entertainment company with over 70 million monthly users. Our core business is an app called Wattpad that lets people read and write stories and connect through those stories. It's all user-generated content, so it's similar to something like what Instagram is for photos or YouTube is for videos. That's what Wattpad is for writing and text storytelling. So users can start posting stories, other users can find those stories, begin following them, see the stories unfold chapter by chapter, and we've built a massive community over the years. Wattpad is 13 years old now, and we've seen our users write over 500 million stories on our platform. And today we work to take a lot of those top stories and transform them into new mediums, like bringing them to print books, which I know we're going to talk more about today, but also partnering with film studios around the world, other digital programs. We're creating new opportunities for writers on the Wattpad platform itself. We really want to help writers be able to build a career on Wattpad.
So traditionally, writers, their first effort is, how do I get the attention of editors or agents. Here, you're sort of bypassing that and saying, how do I get the attention of other folks on the platform to create a groundswell for my book? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I'd even go back further than that. Before you get an editor or an agent, you have to write the story. And I think the New York Times did an article a few years ago saying that, 90% of the population says they want to write a book one day. And most of them don't. And I think just getting that story out can be a really lonely, alienating experience. And on Wattpad, the fact that you can post chapter by chapter, it really helps so many people express themselves. I also think that while, yes, a large percentage of our most successful writers are curious about how they can monetize their work and what they can do for a career, so many writers on Wattpad are doing it for different reasons. It is for self-expression, to be heard, to connect with other people. In the same way that, not all of us that post photos on Facebook want to be photographers. Some of us just want to be acknowledged and to be able to share our work.
Now, you have both, I would imagine, as writer, in terms of the writers on the platform and also the people who are there to read, a younger demographic than publishing at large. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think because we are something that is very social driven and it is, something that is a technology product by, being on apps, we're very mobile focused. That does attract definitely more millennial audience, but millennials are getting pretty old now. I think our core audience is under the age of 30 for sure.
So in the age of texting and just massive amounts of content coming into our lives every day, how do these younger readers prefer to access fiction?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead and finish your question.
Well, obviously the traditional way, which Wattpad Books, which we'll get to, sort of heads toward is, put a book in front of somebody and they read the book. But there's so many different ways to access content now. What are you seeing in terms of how young people prefer to get their fiction?
Yeah, they absolutely want it mobile. 90% of our traffic is coming through mobile devices on phones and tablets. Our users, they want to be able to interact. They don't just want to be broadcast to. They want to participate and be heard and be able to talk to the creators and talk to other readers. Like the social experience is really exciting to young people.
One thing that I get to speak to a lot of interesting folks with a lot of different perspectives on publishing. And one of the things that just keeps coming up in the conversations there, and I'm going to bring it up here, is this idea that we talk a lot about there being so much content out there, but there is also this huge amount of narrative out there. No matter where you are, someone is trying to tell you a story. Every time you watch an ad, every time you log on to Twitter or Instagram or Netflix or whatever, there's somebody there with a story to tell you. At what point do people get narrative fatigue? Do they simply say, you know what, there's also the real world to deal with? Is that a concern?
I think even the real world, we're always making our own narratives in a nonfiction way, and how we even have our sense of self and consider ourselves in the world. I think that humans are a storytelling animal, and we're always looking to find ways to make sense of our own experiences and relationships.
So you think that they'll just continue to grow, this need for people to hear other people's stories will always be there and will always be kind of an expanding area?
Yeah, I think, stories are at the core of most entertainment. Even when we're looking at things that, a traditional book would compete with, a lot of that's also narrative. Even if it's social narratives or nonfiction narratives, I think that that's how we make sense of our place in the world.
Let's talk a little bit about diversity, which is such a hot area in publishing right now and is on the minds of so many folks. I had an interesting chat with Joanna Cardenas from Latinx in publishing for a previous episode. One of the things that Joanna was talking about was that publishing, traditional publishing, is very well-meaning, but because of the kinds of pay that you get and the location where it takes place and all that most people in publishing tend not to be particularly a diverse audience, even as well-meaning as they might wish to be. And that is sort of this structural, institutional problem for publishing. Does Wattpad, by having, I would assume, a fairly diverse user base, manage to avoid that problem, or do you still have that issue, a little bit of lack of diversity in terms of what you're seeing coming out of your own authors?
Yeah, I think we have a tremendous amount of diversity on the platform because we are so global. We do see a lot of marginalized groups come to Wattpad to tell their stories that are being ignored by the traditional publishing industry. I think when you compare the amount of Latinx content, LGBTQ content, even things like Muslim fiction, how much of it we see on Wattpad compared to the traditional industry, that's something I find really exciting as someone coming from the traditional publishing world to see that these aren't the same stories that we're seeing. And I completely agree with the opinions that you voiced. I think that because publishing is an industry that, in most cases, the centers of it are in some of the most expensive cities in the world, London, New York, even Toronto here in Canada. And most people that are looking to enter into the industry have to work for free for 6 months to be able to get an entry-level job. And that's a level of privilege that isn't open to most people. I think I'm really proud that at Wattpad, we do take diversity and inclusion very seriously. As a company, we measure ourselves against our own diversity stats, and we post those publicly. I can share the link for you. But our leadership team is over 50% people of color, over 50% female. Tech has some of its own unique diversity issues that can be a little bit different from publishing. But our company looks like our user base does, and our leadership team also represents our company stats. And that's something that we're really proud to track and continually try to improve on. Let's
move on to Wattpad Books, which is your area now as the leader of Wattpad Books. We have a lot to talk about that because it's absolutely fascinating. But first, describe what Wattpad Books is and will be.
Yeah, so Wattpad Books is an evolution of what we've been doing at Wattpad. For the past 5 years, we've been representing some of our top stories and bringing them to publishers to be published. We've seen numerous New York Times bestsellers, international bestsellers come from stories off of Wattpad. And we've reached a point where we've decided that we are going to invest in publishing those titles ourselves so that we can bring more stories out in the world, rely more on our data and understanding what our users want, to bring stories that aren't what traditional publishers are necessarily picking up, and to be able to respond more quickly to the trends that we're seeing on Wattpad of what readers are looking for. We're launching this fall with 6 titles, and then we're doing 20 next year.
So the thing that obviously will pop out to people when they look at Wattpad Books is this idea, the story DNA, the use of artificial intelligence to help select these books. Describe how that works.
Yeah, so I mentioned some of our numbers that on Wattpad we have over 500 million stories. It would be impossible for any of us to read all of them, but Story DNA lets us look at both machine learning of text analysis as well as our audience data to help us understand some of the top stories are on Wattpad. We're able to see what stories are on the rise and currently growing. One of my favorite stats is to see what are the stories that might be less popular as far as number of readers, but the readers that are reading it just can't put it down. And then we can also do some comparison text of what stories look similar to other stories that we're seeing. I think that something that's important to note is that it's not just a robot that's telling us what books to publish. I think there's, of course, people at the other end of that are looking at and interpreting the data. I think it just really helps us narrow down that pool of all of the content on Wattpad to look at them through different ways and find the stories that our users want.
So this is really where I think the disruption comes in. Again, looking at a traditional publishing house, an editorial assistant sees a manuscript that looks interesting, it's brought to the editorial meeting, it's looked around, people look at it, one editor maybe gets assigned to it, and now we're just dealing with the personal expertise and background, but also opinions of a group of individuals who you said may not be the most diverse individuals in the world. But on the other hand, these are folks who have dedicated their lives to determining what's good, what's not good, and so on. Here we are moving that out of the way and putting the decision-making process in not entirely, but in large part to the readers themselves, to the people themselves and how they react to books. One of the things I found really interesting in researching Wattpad Books is how little pushback you seem to have gotten so far from traditional publishers. Why is that? Why aren't they a little more up in arms about this, do you think?
Yeah, I think publishers have seen some of the successes. We've worked closely with them on so many of them. I think that, it's hard to ignore how big the Wattpad audience is getting. In the US, almost 1 in 3 teenage girls has a Wattpad account. And if you're looking for young readers and how people are going to read in the future, I think Wattpad's a great place to help understand that. I think to your point on how the traditional system works, I think there's fantastic editors that are great at picking stories, and we're not saying that that needs to be thrown out. We just want to open up a new path, and that it doesn't have to be just that. And isn't it interesting to see the stories that other communities are choosing for themselves, and to see the different genres that are flourishing on Wattpad? I think that every time an editor picks a book, they're placing a bet on what they think readers are going to want. That should be the goal, is to bring stories that readers are going to love. And in a lot of ways, we already know that. We can see the stories that are resonating with different communities on Wattpad, and also want to bring those stories to a different audience as well. I'm hoping that people will pick up Wattpad books that aren't Wattpad users today. They might not want to join Wattpad, but I think there's really interesting content that we're looking to bring out to bookstores that represent the best of our community.
Of course, a traditional editor might also say, well, we want to give readers what they want, but we also want to give them books they didn't know they wanted. We want to present things to them and expand their tastes. Do you have that opportunity with Wattpad Books if it's more data-driven?
Yeah, I don't think that data necessarily means the most popular. I mentioned before, one of my favorite stats is looking at the highest average session times. And, that's a data point, but again, it's often will pick up stories that have a really small audience, but everyone that's reading it can't put it down. And to me, that's really interesting this is something that will catch on. This is an interesting proof point to see what people will do with. If most people read an average time of 10 minutes, when someone's reading on average for 40 minutes, that's usually a signal that something's really sticky or good.
Sure. From looking at those, have you learned anything that just simply surprised you as a book lover, as a person who's in publishing, and you start looking at the responses and what people are getting turned on by? Anything that just comes out and says, wow, that's really interesting. I never would have guessed that.
Yeah, I think something coming from the traditional industry, I feel like a lot of decisions are made on comp titles, and that's often one of the areas where people take fewer risks. If there hasn't been a title that's done well in the past, people are afraid to take a flyer on it. And I think we're seeing a lot of those types of stories that often haven't been represented for diversity reasons, like Muslim teen fiction, Muslim romance. Those are massive categories on Wattpad that there are very few examples to point to in the traditional industry. I think it's been really interesting to see how quick our users respond to things in culture, to see how fast things that are happening will start to appear in Wattpad stories, but also how I think something about the traditional industry is everything kind of needs to be fit on a shelf. How are we going to market it? What's the audience going to be? And sometimes there's really amazing stories on Wattpad that are genre bending or new genres, and to see how fast our users understand how to label stories and that readers begin to understand, oh, this is the word I searched for to find more of this. I think that's been the most surprising to me, is to see how fast those new trends can spread.
That has to be something that both must really interest and also frighten traditional publishing a little bit, because on the one hand, they're getting a window into what people want in real time by looking at what you're doing. On the other hand, because of the structure of traditional publishing, they can't possibly keep up time-wise with what happens there. So I find that to me is a real disruption, the ability to change the timeline of publishing, which has always been, from the time a writer starts thinking of an idea and maybe finishes their manuscript, the time it gets published could be a couple of years in some cases.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And we're doing as much as we can to compress that, but there's still so much more that I would like to do, and so much that we can do as a publisher. Like, as soon as you have the book ready, you have the extra hurdle of the buying cycles of retailers. And, some retailers are planning now for their January buying seasons today. So I think we'd love to see flexibility on all areas of the supply chain to be able to meet reader demand when it's there.
Right. One of the things that's interesting about your particular market, particularly if it's for teens and younger and new adults and what have you, is that it's exciting because they'll accept many new things, but I would imagine they're also a little more fickle in terms of bouncing around. If I was a publisher and I put out, let's say, cozy mysteries, I'm good to go for a while, right? Somebody who liked cozy mysteries is going to like them 10 years from now, probably. Somebody who is interested in one very specific new emerging genre, their attention might be drawn by something else next week. How do you deal with that kind of audience?
Yeah, I think we're always looking at what our audience is doing. I think if we were to see something that spikes like that, we do see trends like that all the time that do tend to be a bit more news driven. I think that's exciting in itself, but I think those are also easier to spot as something that maybe is a great thing to try to look for another opportunity for, and maybe that's marketing or PR or something else for the writer, but it might not necessarily have the same long-term interest that a book would. An example is we saw, I don't know if you remember Alex from Target a few years ago on that meme that went viral of this young boy. There really was kind of a spike and across. I think we do a lot of work with our data team to understand what those trends look like and to start to see what that arc of a story that's on the rise and something that's going to be more sustained will be.
That's something, it's funny. I was just thinking about, people 20 or 30 years from now looking back and seeing kind of ephemeral fiction where they wouldn't even understand why it was written, who Alex Target was and all that. That's because we're so used to this idea of fiction being kind of a canon of being, it's set in place. You can go back and read a book from 1935 and basically know what it's about. And yet what you're saying is adding this fluidity to it. That, okay, this was fiction made for this particular moment.
Yeah, the meme equivalent of fiction, for sure.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. That's something really different and fascinating. Talk about how, when you look at the people who are very successful, the authors who are very successful on Wattpad, and whether or not they catch the attention or get to the point of being published by Wattpad Books or not, what are you seeing? Are these people who really have great craft? They've worked hard on their writing? Are these people who are just great storytellers? What are the top traits for someone who wants to succeed on Wattpad?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of both. I think something that I think about a lot is a comment that Margaret Atwood made when she first joined Wattpad of talking about how interesting it was to be and to kind of give practice at another type of writing where you are not just writing for the narrative itself. It's almost, the way that she described it was, Wattpad is not digital books, it's a digital campfire. And you have to get good at that social storytelling and understanding your audience and knowing when to lean in and pull back. And the fact that you can see that in real time as you're writing chapter by chapter, if a reader is catching on to a mystery that you had planned on revealing as a twist in later chapters, you might decide to not go down that route to see if your audience is catching on too early. Or you can edit as you go and make changes based on how the audience is reacting. And there's so much that you can learn from those beta readers that help make it a better story later. I think our best writers understand that. They have a really high EQ of understanding how readers are responding based on the comments and what they're saying about the story. And they're also ones that try to engage them themselves. They'll ask questions. They'll try to get readers invested in the narrative.
So the idea of social storytelling is something that would seem very natural to somebody under the age of 30, because that's what social media has always been, and blogging and so on. May not be as natural to someone over that age. If you're talking to writers who maybe aren't in the Wattpad kind of core demographic, how do you describe social storytelling to somebody who's always thought of writing as being a very private, individual, one-to-one kind of communication form?
Yeah, I think I would use examples, like I said, of, the difference between telling a story around a campfire and watching how your audience is responding to your pacing. I think even looking at things outside of writing, like, in theater and when people shows and seeing how they'll pull a story together and watch how audiences are reacting to it to craft a tighter narrative. I think that for so many people, I think it's also about understanding that what young people's expectations are about how they consume culture is changing. When you look at how much time people are spending with YouTubers and social influencers, and even how they interact with news, they don't just want to be told what is happening. They want to be able to ask questions and to participate. And I think looking at fiction the same way is what we do at Wattpad.
Yeah. Let me just get your input on this subject, because in my other world, with writing blueprints and Children's Book Insider, most of the writers that we talk to are people in their 40s and 50s and 60s. So they have and considering they're trying to write for teenagers, one of the hardest things for them to understand, I think, is the world that millennials have grown up in is so wildly different than the world that baby boomers and Gen Xers grew up in the sense that if you were born in, let's say, 1995 or 1996, especially if you lived in America, but it's the entire world, you've basically grown up in just crazy world, right? You have no, I'm old enough to have some perspective and say, the world wasn't once so completely insane, and maybe it won't it'll get back that way again. But if you're growing up in this day and age, the world just makes no sense. Do you think that this idea of storytelling in a social way is a way for young writers to make sense of the world in a different way than we had to make sense of it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that a lot of our users like to, yes, bounce things off of other people and see how they're reacting. I don't think that they see it as one narrative. I think they want to understand how other people feel about it and incorporate some of those perspectives into their work. But I also think that they also want to understand the world before. I don't think that means that writers from, that are in their 40s, 50s, 60s need to write stories from the point of view of teenagers today. I think that those storytelling is happening and that's of interest to them. But if that's not what comes naturally to them, I think there's also a lot that they can benefit from in social storytelling, but through telling the stories that they understand and that are familiar to them.
Yeah. And so do you think social storytelling, though, helps young people make sense that if other people sort of come together and share their ideas about the way the world is, that somehow that's a comfort to a lone individual, as opposed to an earlier generation where it was sort of like, I'm on my own, here's how I view the world. And it seems to me that need for social connection is kind of a life raft to get through the very turbulent waters of the world right now. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
Yeah, I think that I wouldn't want to say it's blanket in all cases, but I think, yes, we absolutely see a lot of that on Wattpad. And we also see a lot of people that are writing in a very individual way on Wattpad. We're a community of over 70 million people, so there's a lot of kind of intersecting communities and different things that are driving them on the site.
How do you help writers become better writers? Because obviously, it's great to say write. We've always used that with our own folks. But just writing and making the same mistakes over and over isn't going to help you. So do they become better writers by specific feedback? How do they actually develop their craft?
Yeah, I think a lot of our writers on Wattpad create their own writing circles. We have clubs and other areas for education they can go to. We're also not very judgmental, though, on what is good. That's, a judgment term that different people have different perspectives on and have different requirements, and different communities expect different things from stories. I think that by default, Wattpad's a very welcoming community. I think as a writer, unless you're specifically encouraging it, you won't receive a lot of critical feedback on your story or the craft of writing. You'll receive more emotional reactions to the things that are happening to the characters. But there are clubs on Wattpad that writers can join. But to your point, I think that the strongest thing is that practice. For so many writers on Wattpad, what they're posting on Wattpad is the very first thing they've ever written. One of my favorite things to see is to read the last chapter of a book and the first one when I'm looking at a new story on Wattpad, and you just see how they've found their voice through writing. They've gotten a lot of confidence through the audience and knowing that the audience is waiting for them. And I think writers discovering their own style and their own rhythms is one of the things that improves writing the most. The other things of, grammar, that's easy to teach. And in fact, there's never been more options to learn more about that, or even just to have constant corrections through programs like Grammarly, which I think is fantastic as well. But I think having that style and rhythm and storytelling, I think that's one of the things that's hardest to teach.
Do you think that Wattpad has developed or is developing its own style of writing, since it is kind of community-based, very real-time response? I mean, the writing process as it goes through Wattpad is quite different than traditional writing, obviously. Do you think that a new way of writing is being developed somehow?
Yeah, I think we're developing new genres, but I also don't think that means that we're abandoning traditional writing at the same time. When you look at the volume of content on Wattpad, like again, 500 million stories, there are millions of those that are quite traditional narratives that are a traditional 80,000 word structure to a novel with the same pacing. We also have a type of almost like, I describe them as like soap opera novels, where every chapter ends on a cliffhanger and they're hundreds of chapters in, the story shows no signs of slowing down, with new problems and things that the characters encounter and new characters introduced. So I think that because we're not bound by a book that needs to fit on a shelf, that needs to be a certain number of pages, or else they'll be too expensive to ship, I think that opens up new narrative opportunities for writers.
It is funny, as you talk about that, I'm thinking about Mark Twain's books were all generally published as serials in magazines. It's a Back to the Future sort of idea that a lot of great novels that we view as being singular entities actually started that way, exactly this way, with being published piece by piece, chapter by chapter, often with a cliffhanger at the end, so you buy the magazine next week. So I find that's an interesting sort of closing of a circle.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things that we all deal with is this lack of monoculture. Right. So periodically something happens, Game of Thrones comes on and everybody watches it and everybody can talk about it. But for the most part, we all kind of now live in silos. How do you get people who are in one silo in Wattpad to pay attention to the other silos? Or is that an interest to you at all? Do you just say, hey, if you're happy in this particular area, cool, stay there? Or are you trying to create, kind of a broader interest among readers?
Yeah, we try to create different paths for our users to be able to do what they want at that point in time. Sometimes you want more of the same. The episode of Law & Order finishes and you want another one exactly the same. We all have our own habits, but we also sometimes want something new, want something novel. On Wattpad, you can see your recommendations. You can see stories that are new and on the rise. You can explore trending tags. We try to create the spaces that elevate different types of content for different types of writers. And from a data perspective, we're always curious at what our readers are doing too. One of my favorite data points to look at sometimes is something that we have called genre loyalty reports, which you can look at top stories in a certain category and see okay, but for the story, using science fiction as an example, we can look at our most popular science fiction stories, but I can also look at what are the most popular science fiction stories among readers that don't usually read sci-fi, because that's sometimes a different list. And as a publisher, that's really interesting to see what has potential as crossover appeal or what things could maybe hit a bigger audience, even though they're in this genre.
So with Wattpad Books, is that an attempt to create more of not the word monoculture, but something for everyone who's a Wattpad user to look at and go, hey guys, here are some books that came from Wattpad that you all might be interested in. Is that a little bit more of an attempt to break out of a silo and have things that represent the entire community that the entire community can then look at?
Yeah, I think for Wattpad Books specifically, being that it's our first year of launch, we are really focused on North America, which isn't to say as a company we're not looking internationally. In fact, just last month, we announced our own imprint in the Philippines with our partner there, Anvil Books and National Book Chain. So we aren't looking for a one-size-fits-all solution for our entire community. We're looking at what makes sense in different parts of the world based on what our users want. Wattpad Books is one way of elevating a certain type of storytelling, but we're also bringing more stories out into film and TV through our partnership with Sony. We've just partnered with iFlix in Indonesia. We're allowing users to pay by the chapter, and that's something that's doing really well for a lot of our writers too. So we're not really looking for one thing that's going to represent all of Wattpad. I think we're always looking for what do our users love and how can we bring these to print. We're also wanting to make sure that we're doing what our writers want and the more opportunities that they're looking for that we can help service them.
So looking ahead, when I see, and I'm not in your target demographic, so let's say I was, when I see Wattpad at the beginning of a movie, I see it maybe on an audio book, I see it on a physical book, I see it on various pieces of content. What am I to think about that? What? Let me backtrack. In music, there are certain record labels that when they came out, you knew what to expect. If in the early 60s, if Atlantic Records came out with a soul record, you knew it was going to be amazing because Ray Charles was part of it and blah, blah, blah. Blue Note Jazz, right? Certain brands mean something about what to expect when you consume their product. What do you hope that Wattpad represents when people see its name attached to content moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's going to continue to evolve as our audience grows, to be honest. I think we're seeing certain examples so far. I think usually today that means that it's very commercial content. It's things with broad appeal and things with a younger tone that fit that under 30. I think as our audience ages, as we grow into more genres, I think the future of Wattpad Books will be introducing new imprints within the umbrella of Wattpad Books that will be more targeted to the sci-fi community or to other communities within Wattpad, that's absolutely something that we're thinking about. I think for this initial list, we're trying to showcase some of the best stories on Wattpad that are examples of what our readers want and what are examples of bigger trends and movements on the Wattpad community as well.
Great. What would be your advice to writers, whether they're on their Wattpad platform or not, as they prepare themselves for the publishing world moving forward? If someone is just getting started, or maybe someone is, intermediate kind of writer, what's just your best advice for them?
Yeah, I think I've spent a lot of time talking to writers over my career at Wattpad and before, and I think something that I was always really interested in is what they wanted the most. Like in writing a book, what are they trying to get out of it? Are they looking to sell the most copies, reach the most number of readers? Because there are so many paths available to them today. And there are so many writers that I talk to that are telling me about how they're looking for a publisher. And the more you talk to them, it's like, no, you absolutely want to self-publish. Like you will have the best experience doing that. And that's so much more viable across different genres now. And there are some writers that only want to focus on writing and don't want to worry about the business and, trust other people on what the cover looks like. And those ones, yes, are maybe better contenders to work with a publisher. And then there are some people that just want to reach as many people as possible and talk about their story. And those are ones that I think, yes, are, and it's not one path for either. There's some that make more sense to do several different strategies for different books and different markets. We're seeing the rise of the hybrid author, which I think is so exciting. I think there's never been more opportunities for writers, and I'd love to see writers explore more about what it is that they're looking for from this experience and what are the best paths to get there.
Great. For folks who want to know more about Wattpad, I assume they can just visit Wattpad Books, but is there anything particular that they can do to really get their minds around it?
Yeah, I think if they visit Wattpad, we have a writer's portal that gives them an overview of different clubs and communities that are available on Wattpad. And if they search for the writer's portal on wattpad.com, they'll be able to find that for more tips of different opportunities available to them and things they can do on Wattpad.
Great. By the way, in the background, that's Rosie the Disruptor dog. She likes to disrupt the disruptor. So that's what she's doing. One last question for you, and it's always how we end. Who is your favorite disruptor in history? Living or dead? But somebody that you really look to and go, wow, that person really shook things up.
That is a hard question, and I was thinking about that as one to prepare. All I can think about right now are pop culture examples, just that are going on. But yeah, I think I've been obsessed with the new Beyonce documentary. I think some of the change that her and Jay-Z have made to the distribution of music, I think is so exciting to see, and other ways that they're reaching their fans and really taking control and at the top of their game. I think that's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
I think that's a great choice. They've changed the idea of what a pop star is. I think that's tremendous. Well, thank you so much. I hope we can check back in a couple of years and see how Wattpad Books is developing, because I think it's really a fascinating, I wouldn't call it an experiment. It's happening. It's a fascinating thing. And I think it's going to really have a tremendous impact. So I'm really curious to see how it goes. And I wish you great luck with Wattpad Books. And I want to thank you for taking the time to hang out with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're all really excited about it, and I'd love to come back and talk more about how it goes in the future.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Today's episode of Disruptor was brought to you by Writing Blueprints, the breakthrough step-by-step system for writers that creates truly great books. To learn more about the most disruptive way ever to become a successful author, visit writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10% off everything on the site. The writing world has been shaken. Meet the earthquake. Go to writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10%. Writing Blueprints. This is how you write a book.
For show notes and videos, go to disruptcast.online. And to start a disruption of your own, visit writingblueprints.com to discover the most innovative and coolest way ever to write a great book. We'll be back next week. Until then, go forth and disrupt.